Good morning. Viewer, good morning. Welcome to youtube.com. More specifically, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Austin Paul. And if you're watching this video, thank you. I'm excited for you because together, you and I are going to be re-embarking on our journey through my video series entitled Music as Horror, 15 Haunting Albums. I cannot thank you all enough for showing the amount of support and encouragement you did after I uploaded part 1 of this video series 2 weeks ago. Ever since then, I've been getting nonstop just love and support from each and every one of you who has watched the video, taken the time out of your day to come in and say, good job. I really appreciate it because that really only makes me more hungry to work harder and put more effort in for each and every one of you that watches my videos. As you can see, we've got a bit of a different setup this time. Same location, same vibe, but we've got a new camera. It's not mine. It's my brother Sean. So Sean, if you're watching, thank you so much for allowing me to borrow this amazing camera. I hope that you all enjoy the higher picture fidelity, as well as you'll might notice some of the audio levels are going to be a little bit better this time. I'm putting way more effort into the audio levels and the mixing on this one, so I hope you notice that too, and I hope you appreciate it. It's all my way of saying thank you back for being so kind to me as I start this journey into this video making thing. So again, thank you so much for all the support that you've given me, and I can't wait to see what's in store for down the road. If this is the first video in this video series that you're watching, I highly suggest you go back and watch part 1 first, as I lay a lot of groundwork in the beginning of that video, a lot of context to the nature of what we're getting in here with this video series. So I'm going to put the link to the first video in the description of this one so you can just click right on over. And then once you've watched that, come back and enjoy this one. There's plenty of great stuff that we dive into on part 1, really fun stuff. So I hope that you'll take time to watch that as well. And it'll give you a better idea of kind of the vibe that I'm trying to go for. So today we're diving headfirst into tier 2 of Music as Horror, 15 Haunting Albums. What that's going to entail is the next 5 albums that we're going to be talking about together, or rather I'm going to talk at you about, is we are going to be diving further into the abyss. These 5 albums will present us with more difficult themes, more difficult listening experiences, and we'll be grappling with some pretty difficult sounds here. But I believe that the core of these pieces, the core of this art, the core of this music makes the price of admission more than worth it. That being said, I am going to officially announce right here and now, I'm going to put a content warning disclaimer for this video. If you are sensitive at all to graphic depictions of violence, mental illness, ideations of suicide, depression. If you're sensitive to any of those things, there is absolutely no shame in clicking off the video. I myself am someone who at times in my day-to-day life need to take a break from consumption of certain types of media because it really does affect my mental health. And so if you need to do that too, no problem at all. Come back at a later time if you feel like you're ready for it. But with that out of the way, let's get started. I have decided to name Tier 2 The Horror of Humanity. These 5 albums all revolve around and speak to the horrors of the human experience, be it on an individual level or as a shared experience. So, if that sounds interesting to you, stick around because we are about to get started with our first entry into Tier 2. The first album in Tier 2 is actually less of an album and more of a long-form single comprising of just one track at exactly 22 minutes in length. And it is called I Have a Special Plan for This World by a band called Current 93. Current 93 is an experimental music group that was formed by a man named David Tibet way back in, I believe, 1982. Yeah. And David Tibet has been the sole active member of this group since its formation all those years ago. Another extremely active member of this group is a man who goes by the name of Stephen Stapleton, who in his own right was one of the founders and also the sole constant member of his band, Nurse with Wound, which, if you've seen part one, you know Nurse with Wound. So that might give you a little clue as to what we're going to be getting ourselves into here with this first entry. I Have a Special Plan for This World was released in 2000, and it is the very first album of this entire video series that we'll be dissecting that has proper lyrical content. But the lyrics themselves don't come from David Tibet or even Stephen Stapleton, but the American horror author Thomas Ligotti. Thomas Ligotti and Current 93 actively collaborated together for this release. This is a poem written by Thomas, released as a musical album with Current 93 bringing the sounds. I have listened to this piece countless times since starting research for this video series, and it is by far my favorite album that I am going to be bringing to you through all the videos in this project. I can't tell you the amount of times I've listened to it. There isn't a single piece of music that we'll be discussing together that has completely captivated and entranced me quite like I Have a Special Plan has. I find its subject matter, its prose, its shape of sound to be so entirely captivating. Thomas Ligotti and Current 93 have both come together in their respective mediums to create a work of art that is so perfectly synced up. They are using their mediums in perfect tandem with each other. I mean, when have you ever heard of a horror author and an experimental music group coming together to make something together? I mean, it just doesn't happen that I can ever think of. And the fact that we got a project of this nature, let alone a project of this caliber, it just like feels kind of like a miracle. Current 93 created a soundscape and an atmosphere that so perfectly captures the tone and the emotional feeling of Thomas Ligotti's poem. It's almost impossible to imagine them separate from each other, because they're not. They were made for each other, which I think is so, so cool. Ligotti's work has been heavily inspired by writers like H.P. Lovecraft. And that vibe, that style, if you're familiar with that kind of writing, totally comes through all over this thing. It is so profound. It is so interesting. It is so weaving. Like the way that Thomas Ligotti weaves his words in this poem encapsulates everything that I love about the spoken word. It is indirect, it is mystifying, it is bigger than life. It's just that otherworldly largeness that is just kind of intimidating, and you can't ever really see the full shape of what's being discussed because it's too big. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of the feeling that I get. In this poem, we'll be exposed to a depth of sorrow and a depth of despair that you might think is far too much for one person to withstand. And you might be right. The story, or probably better said, this manifesto, is a slow and steady burn that slowly builds, becoming more determined and yet at the same time more disenchanted with each passing verse. David Tibet is the one who will be reciting this poem for us throughout the entire song, and he delivers it in such a dry, cold, flat cadence, inhabiting the broken body and the damaged mind of a man who paints for us a picture of a universe that he finds completely abhorrent and tells us about his special plan to remedy his situation. Since a lot of what this song or album is basically the reciting of a poem, there's obviously music throughout, but Current 93 uses the music as an atmosphere, as a backdrop, to kind of set the emotional tone and express the feeling of the ideations that are being presented to us by the narrator. For the most part, what we'll be digging into for this entry is the lyrical side of things. But I will say that as the sinister intensity of these lyrics grow and develop, the sinister intensity of the music also does the same. It rises with each other, and it completely captivates me and brings me further in, deeper and deeper, as the song or album progresses. Between each verse of the poem, we'll hear what sounds like the clicking of a tape recorder, like a click, and then what precedes that is the incoherent, gargled ramblings of what sounds like a robot. It's like a bit crushed voice that you can perceive as like someone speaking, but you can't make out a word that's being said. This voice, in my interpretation of this piece, could be representative of a certain sardonic spirit that is referenced directly in the poem. And when I think about it in those terms, it almost feels like the weird robotic gurgling that we hear and the recitations of the narrator. It feels like there's kind of some like almost like a dark influence being put upon our narrator. Or it could kind of sound like David Tibet is translating what this creature, what this entity is saying, because we can't understand what it is. Like I said, the music of this piece swells and grows, and it does so in a way that it's one of those situations where you don't even realize it's happening until you realize it. And then again, that sinister intensity is kind of on top of you, and you go, whoa. And it only creates for an experience that is just continually more and more captivating. You want to know what's going to be said next. In the first few passages of this poem, our narrator speaks of hearing men who are talking in their sleep. He says they're either dead or asleep, but they're talking. He says that these people that are talking in their sleep, they're speaking about their plans to change the world, but he contends that their plans do not reach far enough, that the problems of this world can't be solved within its confines. You have to step outside of them. I believe that sleep talking in this poem is symbolic of complacency. People talk about change, they talk about wanting to change the world, but they never act on it. And the sleep talker's plans not being sufficient enough to create lasting change, I believe, is reflected in the narrator's idea that even in our sleep, we cannot escape the world that we're in. That even in a place where space and time don't exist, we are still bound to the things of this world, the things that we can see, that we can touch, that we can comprehend, that we can speak of. That binding makes it so that even when we're sleeping, we can't put ourselves outside of this world. It's all we know. Again, he says that in order to change this world, you can't be within it. You have to step outside of it. He says that there is something greater, a greater darkness. In one verse of the poem, a great reverberating voice speaks to the narrator, almost like a God figure. This voice tells our narrator that all of the things of this world are of but one essence. This is the greater part. This thing that has no beginning, no end, that words cannot speak of. That is the greater part. And all of the things of the world, the things that are bound to the world, that is the lesser part. And this voice asks our narrator, if you remove the lesser part, what are you left with? I believe our narrator's plan is one of complete and utter annihilation, to remove the lesser and step into the greater. To step outside the confines of this world, that thing that has no beginning and no end, that there are no words for. In another passage in the poem, a man beckons to him, and he says the following. Then he said to me, He whispered that my plan was misconceived, that my special plan for this world was a terrible mistake, because, he said, there is nothing to do and there is nowhere to go. There is nothing to be and there is no one to know. Your plan is a mistake, he repeated. This world is a mistake, I replied. It is my interpretation that this poem serves as one man's reckoning with and reason for his suicide. He cannot stand the state of the world that he lives in. He sees it as corrupt, twisted, that its very nature cannot be changed. He needs to go beyond light and dark, day and night, teeth and flesh, hunger, bones, the very dust of the bones, and the wind that will come to blow the dust away. Beyond broken minds and damaged bodies. Beyond what words can speak of. His special plan for this world is to rid himself of the lesser part of himself and to step into that greater darkness where there is nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to be, and no one to know. Nothingness. When everyone you have ever loved is finally gone, when everything you have ever wanted is finally done with, when all of your nightmares are for a time obscured as by a shining brainless beacon or a blinding eclipse of the many terrible shapes of this world, when you are calm and joyful, when you are finally entirely alone, then in a great new darkness, you will finally execute your special plan. Our second album of Tier 2 is called The Drift by Scott Walker. The career of this Ohio-born musician is one that is pretty non-typical. He enjoyed a very storied career creating music in the 1960s with a group from the UK called the Walker Brothers. The Walker Brothers music is kind of stereotypical for what you think of when you think of 1960s music. It's sunny, it's upbeat, it's that. And then when they disbanded in 1978, Scott decided to go off and release solo work. The Drift was his second solo release, and it was the second of a trilogy of albums that he released between 1995 and 2012. So there were many year gaps between these records coming out. The Apple Music write-up for this album describes Scott Walker's solo work as Tony Bennett on acid. And I have a few questions. One, what kind of acid is this person taking? And two, is there like another Tony Bennett that I'm unaware of? Because, brother, this is not that. The script for this album specifically has been kind of hard for me to write because on many levels, this album is beyond my comprehension. It's very difficult for me to process, and I think that's intentional on Scott Walker's part. It doesn't seem like he was going for accessibility when he created The Drift. The lyrical content of this album is over my head, to say the least. If someone can listen to this album from front to back and understand fully what's going on and what's being spoken about, hey, congrats. You have earned your doctorate in both poetry and historical literature, and I'm proud of you. But I did not do that, so I got nothing. I had to do a lot of digging to make sense of what it was that I was hearing, at least lyrically. That being said, though, this album was given high praise when it was released. It got like a 9.0 on Pitchfork. It got like an 85 out of 100 on Metacritic, and many 5-star reviews from other media outlets. And throughout this entire track list, Scott Walker uses his buttery smooth baritone voice. It's a very nice voice. He uses it to sing about some pretty horrific stuff. It makes for a pretty jarring juxtaposition. Ooh, that's a good alliteration. Well, I guess it's not exactly, but I don't know. Scott on this album is exploring themes of wartime atrocity, fascism, violence, like public executions, and just broadly the unspeakable things that humans tend to do to one another. The fact that we do these things to each other regardless of the motivation. Believe it or not, the lyrics are not the only inaccessible aspect of this album. The music is pretty weird too. The musicality and the instrumentation of The Drift is what I imagine you would get if you combined an orchestra with like a metal band. Scott is performing over these writhing beds of orchestral compositions, and he uses guitars and heavy drums and bass lines to build up some of the more chaotic passages in these tracks. It's really hard to tell where the music could go at like any second when you're listening to this album, and not as much in a way as some of the albums that we explored in part one, like Nurse with Wound, where it's just completely left field, like constantly. It's the same instrumentation, but just what Scott Walker is able to do with these compositions is the most unique listening experience that I've ever had. Truly, it is the most unique sounding music, from his vocal performance to what the players are doing with their instruments. I've never heard anything like it. I really mean that. It's very theatrical. What's the word? What's the word for when... I guess that's not really the word. He'll utilize a kick drum as almost like kind of like a... It jump scared me in a couple places where the music will be at a really quiet moment and it'll be kind of a lull, and then you'll just hear poof, 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 and it'll sound like someone is like slamming their fist against the wall of a room that they're trapped in against their will. The string section, too, all across this album is so ominous and so unsettling. They will oftentimes like unravel all together all at once in this wall of discordant wailing that just sends chills down your spine. And then Scott will accompany this beautiful sound with the sound of a donkey braying like wildly, like it's in pain. That particular moment in this album, as I was listening to it, literally gave me goosebumps. I was like, what is happening? I was like, can I keep doing this? Because it's just so bewildering at all times. And just hearing that really tangible, really affecting sound of like an animal like crying. It sounds like it's like crying. I was just like, oh my God, what is this? You know how I said this album is unique? It also bolsters the first and only use of a vocal performance by Daffy Duck that I've ever heard in a piece of music. And no, I'm not joking. That Daffy Duck repeating the phrase, "What's up, Doc?" over and over again to close out one of the songs. Like, I can't... if I'm not painting a picture for you about what you're getting into with this thing, if that's not doing it, I don't know what else I can give you, because if you're like, oh yeah, I've heard that before, you haven't, and you're lying to me. Stop lying. So Scott is singing over all of this. And when I listen to Scott singing, I don't get the feeling that he's singing along to this music. I get the feeling that he's like conjuring it, like that he's commanding it with his voice, like that the music doesn't exist unless he speaks it into existence. It's almost like he's like a dark necromancer, like casting a spell over the listener, and the music is the manifestation of that spell. And it's just like this swirling cloud of musical chaos that is entrancing you, and like that's the feeling that I get. One particular song that sticks out to me in this album is called Clara, and it is a 12-minute track that takes you into many different topics, but over the course of the whole track will take you through one night in the life of a woman named Clara Petacci, who was one of Mussolini's, mistresses. Yeah, that Mussolini. Okay, yeah. So if you do not know, if you don't know who Mussolini is, he was essentially the fascist dictator of Italy and was one of Adolf Hitler's big inspirations. Okay, so Mussolini and Clara Petacci were both killed together by firing squad 2 days before Adolf Hitler's suicide, and they were taken to a town square and hung up upside down for basically the public to abuse their bodies. And Scott Walker in this song is painting a picture in the life of this woman, as well as drawing comparisons to the ways that humans commit violence against each other, regardless of the motive. And so he'll take the death of a figure like Mussolini and the hanging there, and he will compare it to the mob lynchings of America, and that even though the action is the same, the discriminatory nature of America's mob lynchings and the public execution of a fascist dictator like Mussolini, they meet the same fate, but for different reasons. Scott calls this song a fascist love song, and he states that he doesn't like to write all and out protest songs that preach to your face. He wants to write about something that's important to him, like the nature of violence that humans commit against each other, by writing about something else. He's writing directly about something that indirectly speaks to something else. This track is my favorite on the entire album because I think it perfectly encompasses everything that Scott is trying to do with this album, using instrumentation to theatrically color and present a story being told, and using the lyrics to directly speak to something while also indirectly speaking about something related to it. Like, this guy is just operating on a whole different level than you and me. He is like so good at what he does. In that very same vein, the next song on the album, called Jessie, Scott does this yet again, writing directly about the stillborn twin brother of Elvis Presley, using that personal tragedy to explore the depths of sorrow and sadness that maybe a whole country would feel after an event like 9/11. Yes, this song is simultaneously about both 9/11 and the stillborn twin brother of Elvis Presley. Let me clarify, I had to look this up. I did not get that on the first, second, or third listen. I had to go digging. His words are really potent here. Famine is a tall, tall tower, a building left in the night. Jessie, are you listening? It casts its ruins and shadows under Memphis moonlight. Jessie, are you listening? And in the third verse he writes, in the dream I am crawling around on my hands and knees, smoothing out the prairie. All the dents and the gouges and the winds dying down, I lower my head, press my ear to the prairie. Alive. I'm the only one left alive. I'm the only one left alive. I'm the only one left alive. That imagery depicted And the feelings that it conjures is just staggeringly painful, depicting what, as we all know, was one man's lifelong struggle that came to an end by drug addiction and things of that nature, and contrasting that with one nation's greatest tragedy in an event like 9/11, bringing these two things together to explore the truest depths of sorrow that we can experience both on an individual level and as a shared experience. Another really standout track for me is one called Hand Me Ups, which comes out the gate swinging. It literally jump scared me when I was first listening to this album because the last song slowly fades out, and then the first thing that hits, everything just comes in at once, just burr. There are horns in this main refrain, so the song starts out with this main refrain, and Scott's like, and there's just like a drummer just like slamming the crash cymbal, and these horn players, it feels like they're about to pass out. They are playing these horns with such intensity, it feels like their lungs are about to implode. And they are like hitting notes so low, they sound more like a crumbling building than they do like a wind instrument. There's a moment here where I can't tell if what I'm hearing is a woman shrieking or just a very harshly bowed violin. And lyrically, there are some less than euphemistic passages here depicting violence. Brain running down a long spear from the wound in the eye hole. I felt the nail driving into my foot while I felt the nail driving into my hand. This one's intense. It's hard to sum up my feelings for this album in like a phrase or a couple short sentences, but I'll give it a shot. This album to me is like so interesting because it doesn't reveal itself in a straightforward fashion at first. It's very indirect. But I believe that Scott Walker's The Drift is an album that keeps on giving with repeated listens. The more you listen to it, the more it will reveal itself to you. I think its unique sound alone is worth giving it a listen, but the complex depths of the lyrical content are worth returning to in order to kind of dig out some of what's being spoken about here. I recommend you give it a shot if you found that compelling. And without further ado, let's move on to our third entry into Tier 2. The third album, and already the midway point for Tier 2, is a record called Broken Gargoyles by a band named Diamanda Galas. This is a formidable piece of music. I said a band, but Diamanda Galas is actually one woman, a 68-year-old musician from San Diego, California, who throughout her entire career has been creating very challenging music. She creates thought-provoking, demanding music that centers around topics of things like the AIDS crisis, mental illness, war crimes, political injustice. Her 2022 album, Broken Gargoyles, continues this trend. The lyrical content of this album is solely spoken in German, and that's because it is essentially a recitation of 4 poems written by the German poet George Heim. George Heim was a Germanic poet who was the son of an assistant who worked in a yellow fever clinic. During his career, he wrote unabashedly about the way that these sick people, that these wounded soldiers were all treated, the neglect and the horrible living conditions that they faced. This mistreatment and callous attitude towards the sick and infirmed was kind of a catalyst for Diamanda Galas to begin creating this album, because she created it right around the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I don't need to remind you of what that was. But her frustration around how the powers that be were handling such a deadly, widespread pandemic was mirrored by George Himes' writings about similar issues in a different time period. This album is packed front to back with frustrated, enraged, guttural, negative emotions from start to finish. And having a runtime of 40 minutes, it's a lot to sit through. Um, this album is broken up by 2 tracks. Both of them are around 20 minutes in length. It's really, really important to me that I clarify and specify the intentions of this album and the context in which it was created in, because I align myself with those ideations. I align myself with Diamanda Galas in this. I think that the way that this country and many countries around the world handled COVID-19 was pathetic, to say the least. And it was just such a frustrating time. You were there. Whatever side of the spectrum you fall about how COVID-19 was handled, you cannot deny that it was such a frustrating time for those who were truly deeply affected by it. And so that being said, I did not do proper research around the context of this album until after I had fully listened to it. And so throughout listening to this album for the first time, as I was listening to it, I was writing a script for what I thought was being portrayed in this music. And it turns out I couldn't be more wrong, which I think is actually really cool. This album looks, in its album art, it looks, and in in its musicality, it sounds just demonic. It sounds evil. It sounds satanic. And while I was listening to it, I had this whole vision in my mind of what I thought was being depicted. And I'm glad that I was wrong about that, because so often art forms that are judged at face value as just being like satanic or evil or demonic, they often have so much more interesting things to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with you beat by beat through all 40 minutes of this album, and I'm going to describe to you, again, what I thought was being portrayed as I was listening to this music. And again, I cannot stress this enough. What I'm about to talk about is not what this album is about. Unless you speak German and you know what is being literally spoken in this album, you kind of just have to go off of the feeling of it. You have to go off of the emotion of the music. And I think that the incredibly high level of production on this album really makes it easy for your mind to run away with it. This record, the sounds that you hear in it are so perfectly tuned and mixed and layered on top of each other. It sounds very cinematic. Like, it sounds like I'm listening to a movie rather than listening to a musical album. So, without further ado, I'm going to take you from beginning to end of this album, and I'm going to describe for you what I thought was happening. It's not, but I'm going to tell you what I thought. The first track is called Mutilatus, which is a Latin form of the word mutilate. This album opens up, and it essentially sounds like somebody snuck a microphone into the shack of an old German witch in the middle of the woods as she is opening a portal to hell using black magic. She's reciting this spell in her native German tongue, and the longer she does this, the more overcome with this dark energy she becomes, and her voice becomes distorted, and it's warping as it feels like she's becoming more aligned with something that she's conjuring out of this portal. At the 10-minute mark, we hear piano. It's like choking. I imagine like this portal open and all this like black smoke like pouring into this shack, and this piano is trying to cut through, but it's being choked out, and it literally sounds like it gets stomped out. Like, it sounds like something just like stomps it and just like kills it. There's like this growling beast, and you hear like these thuds. Like, it's the very nature of this piano, the very thing that it does, it creates music. It's like it's like pissed that it's like creating something nice. It's like, you. Like, what follows that is it sounds like we follow her as she steps out into nature outside of the shack. You can hear her feet stepping on fallen, dried leaves. And as she comes into nature, you hear the animals, the wildlife become unraveled as this dark magic, as this entity grows stronger and stronger. You hear like coyotes yelping and like birds squawking, like everything knows something is not okay. Like something evil is happening, and it's stirring up the very nature of the world. She starts howling, screech singing like into the night sky, and I picture like the moon being like a full moon, the pale moonlight just starting to like glow brighter and brighter and illuminate her. And then the piano returns and it's being played almost as if it's signaling that this summoning ritual has been completed. And it's like not being played, it's like being beaten. Like it's like, boom, boom, boom. Like it's not pretty piano music. It's like hatefully being slammed on. So that's the end of the first track. And the second track is called Abiectio, which is a Latin originated word that basically means to reject or to toss away or to discard. And it was my interpretation of this song title that this old woman, this witch, was now casting off her humanity, that she was opening this portal and conjuring this spirit in order to fill her with some dark power or something like that. She's throwing away her humanity, trading it for a darker power. For what reasons? I don't know. She's like, consume me. Did you know that if you make a deal with the devil always wins? If you've ever wanted to hear what it sounds like when someone is on the receiving end of that loss, help yourself to the first like minute and a half of this second track. You know how, I hope you don't know, but you know how like when someone is screaming so feverishly, so loudly, so gutturally, they don't sound human anymore. They sound like an animal almost. That's what this is. So that's super nice. And then she slowly stops and it's like she's like kind of over like that first bit of like pain, and she begins to continue to chant, and it's sounding more laborious. It's causing more pain, but she's pushing her way through it. Like she is really giving it all she's got, and it is harrowing to listen to. It sounds so guttural and so, you can just feel the energy, and you can feel that energy, and it's so intense. Like I was like tense listening to it. It's really wild. Oh, and then like she starts groaning, and then you hear what sounds like a creature, like a growling creature, start to groan in sync with her. And as she becomes more pained and more labored, the growling, groaning, like that other entity, it starts getting louder and more powerful. Like it's something. It's really something to listen to. It's, again, that high production level. You can just imagine this happening in your head. Like you don't need to work that hard. Like it's creating a visual for you. Again, not what's being talked about, but I feel like the very fabric of the air. You remember there's a scene in Hereditary where Toni Collette's character is performing a seance with her husband and her son to try to talk to the spirit of her daughter. There's like a moment where the son goes, "Do you feel that? It feels like the air is flexing." And I always thought that was such a cool thing, like such a cool idea, that like the air around you is like flexing and kind of like gripping on you. When I'm listening to these two, this woman and this entity like groaning and grunting, like it feels like the air is being compressed around and like I don't know, like wrapping her up and like constricting her. And then for the final portion of this spell, her voice has been completely replaced by this growling, hideous, fiendish, demonic sounding voice, and her humanity has been completely cast off, and she is now completely consumed by whatever this thing is. So it's a lot, but I think it's really cool to listen to. And again, those frustrated, negative emotions are so perfectly captured here. That being said, I don't know if you can call this music. I think the only reason that it appears on a service like Apple Music or Spotify is because we don't really have like a word for it. Like I imagine Apple unveiling at some Apple conference, they'll present like coming fall of 2024, Apple Ritual. All of your favorite dark spells and incantations now in all one convenient place. Yeah, Diamanda Galas has created an experience here that is so captivating. I couldn't turn it off. I was at work when I was listening to this. There were a couple of moments when people came to like come talk to me about something, and I like told them I was on the phone. I like did this. I was like, because I didn't want it to stop. It was like an intense part, and I didn't want to be like, you just are like, and then like someone's like, click, oh yeah, no, it's over there. Okay, click. Like just, I don't know. Okay, I'm being a little silly, but this album is really cool. And if that interests you, I think you should definitely check it out. And now without further ado, let us move on to our fourth most album of Tier 2. Ladies and gentlemen, non-binaries. Okay, folks, there we go. Folks, we have reached our fourth most album of Tier 2. And before we get started with anything, I just want to let you know right off the bat, this one is a doozy. The fourth entry for Tier 2 is none other than a record by the name of Girl with Basket of Fruit by a band called Shoo Shoo. Released in 2019, this is Shoo Shoo's 11th album. That's wild. That's a lot of albums. And it was received with generally a lot of favorable reviews. Shoo Shoo takes all 36 minutes of this album's runtime and just packs it overflowing to the brim full of anger, frustration, sorrow, tension. It's jam-packed in there. The name of this album, Girl with Basket of Fruit, is actually a spin-off of a famous painting entitled Boy with Basket of Fruit by the Italian artist Caravaggio. Jamie Stewart, who is the kind of the front man for Shoo Shoo, had a lot to say about this intentional gender swapping in the title of the album versus the title of the painting. I want to read you what he said. When this title is a boy, it is fey and lovely. When it is a girl, it is worrisome and rife with danger. Male martyrs are almost always surrounded by nurses, their mothers, adoring angels, and other loving disciples wrapping their crushed and holy bodies in strips of herb-soaked cloth and weeping rapturously. Female martyrs are almost always depicted having their skin flayed, breasts branded or ripped off with tongs or being stabbed, and they are always, always alone, save for their murderers. There is never anyone by their sides, celebrating their spiritual life, only fiendishly reveling in their torture of her. It is perilous to be a girl. Yeah. Right, I agree. So what we're going to be getting into with this album is extremely potent and a very well cared for expression of this very idea. Again, before we go any further, this one's a doozy. The manic energy of Girl with Basket of Fruit is unrelenting from the very first second that you turn on this record. The first track on this album is full of fast-tempoed, glitching electronic sounds, percussion, buzzing synths. It is accompanied by a vocal performance by Jamie Stewart that is equally, if not more, unhinged as the music itself. And this is a very common carry through for this entire album's runtime. Jamie is not singing. Instead, he is screaming, shrieking, whispering, sobbing, all of the lyrics here. Speaking of the lyrics, let's get into that. Let's dive into that a little bit. These ones are not for the faint of heart. With each passing line of each verse of each song on this record, Jamie Stewart utters a sentence never before heard by humankind in the history of recorded speech. I'm really grateful that in the mix of this album, on the production side of thing, Jamie Stewart's vocal performance is so overwhelming and loud. It's totally blown out. It's digitally distorted because he's screaming, and you get that clipping sound. It makes for the vocals to come through pretty muffled and distorted again, and so you really got to listen closely in order to hear what he's saying. You can read along, but these lyrics are just as unpleasant to read as they are to listen to. Here, let's go through a passage together. Her gets so floppy, she uses it as a fan to wave away his sickening BO. Now, rubbing it off with a brick, dust for his panettone. Every frog hops right up into her butthole. Every frog eats a single butthole flea on its way in. She squeezes them all into frog ghost. One word, frog ghost. A flock of on bat wings peeks in her sleeping face and pointlessly tries to fuck a blue sky. None of those words are in the Bible. This song is disarrayed, loud, aggressive, in your face, and it's this manic energy that lends to these ridiculous phrases to feel just so like mentally disturbed. It's disturbing to listen to, for sure. What's really nice about this album is that the high energy of this first song is not indicative of what the rest of the album will sound like. It comes out swinging, but there's actually a lot of sonic variety in the arrangement of these tracks. You'll hear some pretty slow, somber songs. You'll hear some more dancey songs. You'll hear more theatrical songs. There's a good mix here, which is really nice. Again, Jamie Stewart's vocal performances here are so perfectly in line with the nature of the instrumentation. When it's a slow, somber song, again, he's not singing, he's sobbing. Yeah, there's just a lot going on, and it's really cool to listen to. The track entitled Amargi Vemu features a very soft vocal delivery from Stewart. It's accompanied by, I believe, like a quartet, a string quartet. Like you hear a stand-up bass, you hear a cello, you hear maybe a viola or a violin directly after that first opening song, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And so it's quite a tonal shift, but it's kind of a nice reprieve. But do not mistake quiet for calm. Like I said, Jamie Stewart is not singing, he is sobbing. He speaks a line that gave me goosebumps. It's very affecting, his tone of voice. He says, "I am not ready and cannot accept that it has spread like a cancer." That devastated timbre of his voice, it really gets to you. It's very well done. The closing track to this record is called Normal Love, and it's very much in line with the sonic tonality of this song. It's another slow, somber musing about the nature of love and depicting someone who wants to feel normal love, and it's really heartbreaking to listen to. The song Pumpkin Attack on Mommy and Daddy is a banger. This song is so dope. It is really akin to something that I feel like Major Lazer would put out. If you've ever heard the song Pont de Fleur by Major Lazer, it is that like bombastic, like it's really dancey, and it's so good. It's so fun to listen to. A lot of like 95% of the vocal performance on this track is done by another member of the group. Her name is escaping me at the moment, but she essentially drunkenly ad-libbed all of the lyrics to this song. I think the story was that she just kind of rambled. Like her and Jamie were just like in the stew, and she was just rambling off about different things. And so he took all of those things and just like cut them up to create a lyrical flow for the song. And it's really silly and really outrageous. There is mention of, I believe it's a Korean creation myth, that there was like a few animals that were given a ton of garlic, and if they ate all the garlic, that they would be turned into humans. And I think the bear was the only animal that did it. So the bear was turned into a woman, and that's how humans were created. And it's almost like they were talking about it. And again, this other member of the band is drunk, and so she's like, if you wanted to be a human, all you had to do is eat garlic. And it's just like paired with this really fun, like dancey, like trap dance song. It's really, really fun to listen to. And you're just like, what is this song about? It's really fun. And then there is the song on this album that made me want to put it on this tier. Again, this tier is called The Horror of Humanity. And this song captures it as well as I could ever think you could. It's called Mary Turner, Mary Turner. And I believe this song not only perfectly captures my categorization for this tier, right, the horror of humanity, I believe it also perfectly encapsulates Shushu's intention for this album, this name, speaking of female martyrs. I believe it perfectly encapsulates that idea. So, again, I'm going to reiterate here, content warning. What we're about to get into is pretty intense and pretty horrific. Graphic depictions of violence. So, just so you know. This song is a direct, no punches pulled recounting of the lynching of a woman named Mary Turner, who at the time she was murdered was 19 years old and was also 8 months pregnant. This happened in America, in the South, in 1918. The reason why Mary Turner was lynched by a lynch mob was because she was publicly speaking out against the lynching of her husband, Hayes Turner, who was literally lynched the day before. And again, the lyrics here, this song is basically a recounting of what was done to Hayes and Mary Turner and the baby that Mary was pregnant with at the time of her murder. I will not be going into detail about that, nor will I be going super into detail about the lyrics. But that being said, if you don't know this story, which I didn't know before I listened to this album, I think you should do yourself a favor and look into it. The unspeakable horrors that were put upon this young black family were done because of the color of their skin. And that's it. That hatred, that level of hatred that we can harbor against each other for something so immaterial as what someone looks like is, it's unbelievable what we're capable of doing to each other. And I think it's important that we look at those things face first, head on, remind ourselves of what we're capable of in order to soften ourselves. If we don't keep the past alive in some ways, we're doomed to repeat it. Now, if you're going to go looking this up, don't do it at work. You're going to be met with some pretty horrific imagery. But I think it's important that for ourselves as individual people, we face these atrocities head on. We stare them directly in the face and we be better people. That is so important. All we can do is be better. Remember what we're capable of and be better towards each other. Jamie ends this song with the words, "Fuck your war, fuck your guns, fuck your truck, fuck your flag." And that's, yeah. So, I need a break. But we're not done yet. We still have one more record to dive into. So without further ado, you want to go? Come on. Come on, let's go. Let's do it. Let's move on to our fifth and final album for Tier 2. Our final entry into Tier 2 is what else? None other than the album God's Country by a band named Chat Pile. Chat Pile is a band out of Oklahoma who have recently started making waves in the music scene, even going so far as having this album be reviewed by the internet's busiest music nerd himself, Anthony Fantano. And I believe he gave it an 8, something like that. God's Country is Chat Pile's debut album. They released a few EPs before that, but this is their first full-fledged official release. And let's just say these boys came out swinging. Their sound has been categorized as noise rock and sludge metal. And to me, musically, this album is very hard to sit through. Sonically, the instrumentation is packed with these gurgling, muddy bass lines, drums that sound like the snare is like 50 pounds, just big, thumping, thudding, 3-ton bass drums, and like discordant guitar riffs that wail all over this thing. These instruments are angry, they're coming for you, and they are much, much faster and much, much stronger than you. Once again, the concepts and themes explored in God's Country are very much in line with our categorization of the horror of humanity. The album art itself is just a photograph of the Oklahoma County Detention Center, where 11 people lost their lives the same year that this album was released. These songs are misanthropic, furious, and unrelenting in their depictions of what humans are capable of doing to each other. What turns my stomach about this album, and I mean that literally, is the vocal performance given by frontman Randy Hire. This dude is f***ing out of his mind. He sounds feral. There is a quality to his vocal delivery that will always keep you on edge. You never know if the next word out of his mouth will be screamed at the top of his lungs or delivered in a cold, flat, unfeeling way. And when I say scream, this ain't Hawthorne Heights. This ain't even, I don't know, like Bring Me the Horizon or something stupid like that. This is everything you got. Throat be damned, screaming, yelling at the top of your lungs with a level of hatred that I didn't think was possible. But it is. That's what this album is to me. It is the manifestation of pure rage. And Chat Pile has a lot to be angry about. The very first track of this album is entitled Slaughterhouse. And it depicts the real-life beheading that took place in a food processing plant in Moore, Oklahoma. Story goes, apparently, an employee who was struggling with schizophrenia was fired, and then days later came to the plant armed with a knife and attacked several employees, killing a few and beheading one. This track opens up with the heaviest drums you've ever heard reverberating into a dark hall that just punch you in the face, and then everything else joins in all at once, and it is a breakdown with all of the weight of the sun's gravitational pull. This thing is so fucking heavy. It is actually so sick, but and then you get Randy Hire screaming at the top of his lungs the phrase hammers and grease, and it just sounds, again, he sounds out of his mind. So if you hear the first 30 to 45 seconds of this track and you think, hey, this might not be for me. This might be a little much for me. Think it's a perfect time to hop off because it ain't getting any nicer. One standout track for me, actually my favorite track in this album, is the very next song, the second song entitled Why, which asks the very simple but loaded question, why? Why do people have to live outside? This idea, this question is repeated over and over again, each time with increasingly more frustration and anger. Why? Why do people have to live outside? Why? Why? We have the means, we have the resources. Why? Have you ever had to live outside? I couldn't live outside. Have you ever had to push all your shit around in a shopping cart? Have you ever had ringworm? Have you ever had scabies? Why? Why do people have to live outside? And as you hear it just progressing and getting angrier and more frustrated, it feels like Randy Heyer is marking you as being complicit in this nationwide tragedy, this horror of horrors, this very real atrocity that is happening every day in our lives, and we're just conditioned to walk past, and we see these people on the street and we think that they're there because of some bad life decision or something like that, which is so simplistic and such an oversimplification. It is truly affecting listening to this song. He says the words, "It's a fucking tragedy, real American horror story." And yeah, I completely agree. A lot of the songs on this album are pretty similar sonically, right? It's a band, so you've got drums, guitar, bass, vocals, so it sounds very similar. But around the midway point of the album, you get a track entitled "I Don't Care If I Burn," which completely flips the script and does away with all instrumentation, and it is essentially a spoken word piece where frontman Randy Heyer is speaking over the sound of matches being struck over and over again on top of each other, kind of like this never-ending just barrage of matches being struck, and then the slow, steady, rhythmic pounding of a kick drum. When I said that this album is the manifestation of pure hatred, yeah, the ideas and the intent presented here and the lyrics and the vocal delivery are basically just murderous. It's just a spoken word piece, someone talking about wanting to kill someone very specifically. There's a really jarring scream towards the end of it, and it's harrowing. Like I said, the intensity of this vocal delivery really is like what makes this album so affecting. It's really hard to listen to. And when I said that this album is hard to listen to, I don't mean the nature, like the genre of the music. I actually think that this album is so dope sonically. The guitar riffs, the drums, like it all sounds really cool. It's super heavy. It's like it really gets you thrashing around, but this vocal performance is absolutely spine chilling, and it is really unsettling to listen to, and it is really hard to sit through. The perfect example of this is the closing track of this album, which is now seared into my memory forever. It is called grimacesmokingweed.jpg. And, that's a silly name. What a funny little name. Grimace from McDonald's, smoking weed. Hilarious. I promise you, there's nothing silly going on here. This song is 9 minutes long, and if you decide to listen to it from start to finish all the way through, I promise you, you will be worse off at the end of it than you were going into it. If I had to give you an idea of what I think is going on with this song, it's not hard to tell. This is basically what I imagine what it would be like if you were to experience walking into someone's room who is having a mental breakdown and who is very at risk of ending their own life. And you hear every single bit of that for 9 minutes. You hear Randy like interrupting himself, almost like in a schizophrenic episode, and saying stuff like "stupid, shut up, no!" Like arguing with himself. It's really, really intense. I'm not doing it any justice, but the word for it is harrowing. Oh yeah, and Grimace is there and he's smoking weed. I kind of like have to, I feel like I need to joke when I talk about this song because it's the only way that I can talk about it without feeling like complete and utter total. Yeah, I don't really want to get into a lot of what's said in this song. I don't really feel like doing that to you or to me. So let that be your guide to make up your mind whether or not you want to listen to this song. I leave that to your discretion. And while I've spoken about this album as being right the manifestation of pure hatred, I also recognize that those feelings are valid and those feelings have a place in the human experience. They have a right to be expressed. It can be very cathartic to express these emotions in a healthy manner. And that doesn't mean that it has to be pleasant because, again, a lot of this stuff is unpleasant. These emotions are unpleasant. The subject matter is unpleasant, but it needs to get out. We need to get it out. You might be wondering, why do I want to put myself through something unpleasant like that? What is there to gain? And I think that my answer to that would be two reasons. The first one is I think that, for me at least, listening to an album like this and listening to all this entire video series, this is a point of curiosity for me. This is something that I'm interested in. And I think it's very natural for us as people to want to know the dark side of the experiences that humans go through. We want to know how deep the rabbit hole goes, you know? We want to look down into that abyss and see just how bad it can get as a curiosity. And the second reason would be that I actually find that there is a ton of humanity represented in these songs. We're discussing the horrors of that humanity, right? But at the core of it, it's human experience and it's being expressed by people. Like I said, these feelings are normal and it's healthy for them to be expressed. And it can be cathartic for people to do that. And sometimes the way that those feelings get expelled and expressed are through making art. And sometimes that art is making really intense music. And I think that's so valuable. I think that's beautiful that we can do that. That we can take these things that are so atrocious and so hurtful and so harmful, and we can create something not conventionally beautiful, but really powerful and affecting and positive, even if it's something that you just window shop every now and again. Music is a super visceral medium, right? I mean, that's why we're talking about it, this feeling of fear that it can instill in us. It's why it can get us out on the dance floor and forget about all our cares, you know? It can give us like chill lo-fi beats to study and relax to. It can make us stoic and contemplative. It can stir up and encourage feelings already present within us, and it can coax out and bring out emotions that are repressed. It can also probe us with very challenging subject material and force ourselves to ask ourselves questions, challenging questions. Questions like, why do people have to live outside? And with that, I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in to part 2 of my video series, Music as Horror, 15 Haunting Albums. This has been tier 2 of our series, and I, once again, cannot wait to come back again here with you all for part 3, which I promise I'm working on and will get out to you as fast as possible. When I first started this project, I was like, all right, I'll make one video and then I'll release the next one 5 days later and then I'll release the next one 5 days after that and it'll come out perfectly on Halloween. And what an idiot. I didn't know anything about all of the work that this process entails, and so it is coming out much longer than I anticipated. It's taking a lot more work, but again, your kind encouragement, your support empowers me to work even harder to bring you better content. So if you liked this video, please give it a like, give it a comment for the algo. Subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel. I plan on making this a regular thing that I do. And I just am so blessed and so encouraged by the nice things that you all have said about this project. I'm glad that you all take interest in it. I'm glad that it's something that it's fun for you to watch. It's super fun for me to make. I want to keep doing it, and I'm going to work as hard as I can to bring you the best stuff that I can. So my name is Austin Paul. I can't wait to see you in part 3. Until then, my friend, bye-bye.